Good evening, and welcome to First Church Berkeley, United Church of Christ. My name is Kit Novotny, and I'm one of the ministers here at First Church. We are a progressive faith community committed to the exploration of religion and spirituality through art, music, and literature. And we get to be this renowned venue for community conversations of many kinds. And so it is our delight tonight, in partnership with our friends just up the road at All Souls Episcopal Parish, to welcome the poet Christian Wiman, a writer whose soulful and rigorous work illuminates the bright abysses that inhere in the life of a modern believer. This weekend is a long time in the making, and we're so excited to finally be able to bring Chris out here to the Bay Area, just in time to whisk him out of a New England snowstorm. Welcome, Chris. Tonight, Chris will begin by giving a talk entitled The Art of Faith, the Faith of Art. And he will then be joined in conversation by Marvin K. White, our public theologian in residence. Woohoo. Enthusiastic crowd, I like it. Poetry doesn't always get that, so here we go. You may have seen an index card on your seat, and there may be extras floating around near the end of the pew, and there may be some extras coming around later. So you're invited to write a question that may come to mind during Chris's talk, and we'll collect those at the conclusion of the talk as we move into conversation. And so then during the final portion of our evening, Marvin will relay some of those questions to Chris. An invitation, we hope that many of you will also join us tomorrow morning, you may have seen this on your way in, at 10:30 a.m., held at All Souls Church over on Cedar Street in North Berkeley. This will be a continued conversation, a little more intimate than tonight, with both Christian and the poet Nate Klug. And tomorrow's conversation will be emerging primarily out of the anthology Chris recently edited for Yale University Press, which curates 100 of the most evocative modern poems on joy. So if you could use a little joy in the middle of Lent, we hope to see you tomorrow morning. And now it is my joy to introduce this evening's two poets. Marvin K. White, MDiv, who will join us in the second half of this evening, is this year's public theologian in residence here at First Church Berkeley, and a recent Yerba Buena Center for the Arts Equity Fellow. The author of 4 collections of poetry, he is articulating a vision of social, prophetic, and creative justice through his work as a poet, artist, teacher, preacher, and Facebook statistician. Welcome to Marvin. And Christian Wiman, poet and essayist, is the author of many books, including most recently his selected poems, Hammer is the Prayer, the anthology I mentioned, Joy, 100 Poems, and a book of essays, My Bright Abyss, all of which happen to be for sale in the lobby. Many thanks to our friends Mary and Carlo from Sagrada Sacred Arts Bookstore. From 2003 until 2013, Wiman was the editor of Poetry Magazine in Chicago, the premier magazine for poetry in the English-speaking world, and he is currently a professor of the practice of religion and literature at Yale Divinity School. About his work, the novelist Marilynne Robinson says, "His poetry and scholarship have a purifying urgency that is rare in this world. This puts him at the very source of theology and enables him to say new things in a timeless language so that the reader's surprise and assent are one and the same." Please join me in welcoming Christian Wiman.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Kit. Kit and her husband, Nate, are old friends of mine, dear friends. It's great to be here back with them. I knew them from Chicago. I am going to begin with some of a book that I'm going to publish this fall, a prose book. And this is the sort of subtitle that is on the book. The book is called He Held Radical Light, which is comes from a poem by A.R. Ammons. And I mention A.R. Ammons a little bit in here, but in the book I mention him several times. The book has an epigraph. The world does not need to come from a God. For better or worse, the world is here. But it does need to go to one. Where is he? And that is why the poet exists. And that's by Juan Ramón Jiménez. So this is how the book begins, and then I'm going to skip about 50 pages and tell you an anecdote. The book is framed around various encounters that I've had with poets over the years. I stayed up late last night reading the letters of A.R. Ammons, who for years sowed and savored his loneliness in lonely Ithaca, New York. Keep Ithaca always in your mind, wrote Constantine Cavafy. Arriving there is what you're destined for. And he did, Ammons, keep that mythical Ithaca in his mind, which is to say, in his poems, decade after decade of diaristic ramblings that are as flavorless as old oatmeal this morning, as null and undifferentiated as deep space, then lit up suddenly by a meteoric masterpiece that must have surprised the workaday writer as much as it does the fatigued reader. It is heroic and it is pathetic, like the life of any real writer, I suppose, all the waste space one fills as one can, some with silence, which is often excruciating for the writer, some with noise, which passes that agony along to the reader. And all for what? Those moments of mysterious intrusion, that feeling of collusion with eternity, of life and language riled to the one wild charge. Okay, who's got this thing? The line breaks are, we couldn't get all this on one line, but I wanted you to be able to follow along. This is Ammons. When you consider the radiance, that it does not withhold itself, but pours its abundance without selection into every nook and cranny not overhung or hidden. When you consider that birds' bones make no awful noise against the light, but lie low in the light as in a high testimony, when you consider the radiance, that it will look into the guiltiest swervings of the weaving heart and bear itself upon them, not flinching into disguise or darkening. When you consider the abundance of such resource as illuminates the glow blue bodies and gold-skeined wings of flies swarming the dumped guts of a natural slaughter or the coil of shit, and in no way winces from its storms of generosity. When you consider that air or vacuum, snow or shale, squid or wolf, rose or lichen, each is accepted into as much light as it will take, then the heart moves roomier. The man stands and looks about. The leaf does not increase itself above the grass, and the dark work of the deepest cells is of a tune with May bushes, and fear, lit by the breath of such, calmly turns to praise. I met him once, A.R. Ammons, 30 years ago. I was an undergraduate at Washington and Lee University in Virginia, where I was a member of the last all-male class in the school's 250-year history. It was also, I later learned, the worst class in the school's 250-year history. That's true, actually. I had arrived alone from far west Texas in my midnight blue, T-topped, Screaming Eagle Trans Am, which would hit 130 miles an hour for anyone young enough or fool enough to do it, and which I sadly but promptly sold to pay for books, boxer shorts, I'd never seen such a thing, booze, food. That was always an urgency then, money. I delivered the Richmond Times-Dispatch on foot, 6 a.m., 7 days a week. I worked in the university news office and in the dining hall, served as food manager for a fraternity, strung tennis rackets many evenings in the gym. In one particularly needy season, together with another student who had the means to be the bank, I was the muscle, or more accurately, the nag. I ran a gambling line for professional football, posting our hieratic odds on the doors of dorms and fraternities, and sitting all afternoon dipped in a sort of existential antbed, feeling the stings of defeat in every other play. It was mortifying at times, but in the way of American intellectuals whose accomplishments are rooted in real dirt, I have made a badge of my embarrassments, and any shame of monetary or mental unfitness has faded into an ironic attribute, like distressed furniture. I was a virgin when I heard Ammons read. A virgin of poetry readings, I mean, though the experience was probably more memorable and momentous than the other one. It occurred to me that Ammons might have been equally innocent and equally confused. As 10 minutes into his reading, he suddenly stopped and said, "You can't possibly be enjoying this." Then left the podium and sat back down in the front row. No one knew what to do. Some people protested from the pews, we were in a place that had pews like this, that they were in fact enjoying it, though the voices lacked conviction and he didn't budge. Finally, the chair of the English department cajoled the poor poet into continuing. Ammons mumbled on for another 15 minutes before the cold mortification of the modern poetry reading and the beer-lacquered bafflement of press-ganged undergraduates did him in. "Enough," he muttered finally, and thudded his colossal body down beside his wife like the death of faith itself. When I left college and set out to be a poet, I thought of nothing but writing a poem that would last forever. That's just how I phrased it, last forever. It seemed to me the only noble ambition, and its fumes were evident in my contempt for the lesser aims I sniffed out in other writers. It was, I suppose, a transparent attempt to replace the soul with the self. For all the talk of the extinction of personality, I suspect there is no artist who does not cling to the belief that something essential of himself inheres in his art. This was the first casualty of Christianity for me. People tend to think that Christians feel rescued from death, and perhaps some do. I don't. But first there comes the purge. Nothing survives, I suddenly realized. Dante, Virgil, even sweet Shakespeare, whose lines will last as long as there are eyes to read him, will one day find that there are no eyes to read him. As a species, we are a microscopic speck of existence, which, I have full faith, will one day thrive without us. Still, abstract oblivion is a small shock as shocks go. When over lunch one day, my friend and then poet laureate Donald Hall turned his camel-blasted 80-year-old Yeti decrepitude to me and said as casually as he bit into his burger, I was 38 when I realized not a word I wrote was going to last. I felt a galactic chill, as if my soul had chewed tinfoil. I was 38. It was the very inverse of a calling, an ex post facto feeling of innocence, death's echo. In a flash, I knew it was true for both of us. This is no doubt part of what he was telling me. And yet the shock was not in that fact, but in the nearly 50 years of further writings Don had piled on top of that revelation. Poetry abandoned me, he writes in his little masterpiece, Essays After 80, the compensatory prose of which is so spare and clear it seems inscribed on solitude itself. If there were any justice in the world, this book would be read by my great-great-great-great-granddaughter as she gets ready to die. But of course, there is no justice in the world. Okay? They will put my body into the ground. Chemistry will have its way for a time, and then large beetles will come. After that, the small beetles. Then the disassembling. After that, the Puccini will dwindle the way light goes from the sea. Even Pittsburgh will vanish, leaving a greed tough as winter. What is it we want when we can't stop wanting? I say God, but Jack Gilbert's greed may be equally accurate, at least as long as God is an object of desire rather than its engine, end rather than means. Gilbert's poem amounts to a kind of metaphysics for materialists. Something survives us, the poem suggests, some cellular imperative ravening past whatever cohesion kept us, some life force that is suspiciously close to a death force. It's winter in this poem, after all, and not any ordinary winter, but one from which even Puccini and Pittsburgh have vanished, an winter, you might say, even perhaps a nuclear one. Of course, on the literal level, the poem is referring to the way information dies out in one man's brain. Gilbert was actually from Pittsburgh, and I assume he loved Puccini. But the end of the poem reverberates in a way that is both beautiful and terrible. When you are ending, it can seem like everything is, and the last task of some lives is to let the world go on being the world that they once loved. But what song, or what but song, can contain that tangle of pain and praise? Okay. And hear the dark infinitive to feel, which would endure and have the earth be still and the star-strewn night pour down the mountains into the hissing fields and silent towns until the last insomniac turned in must end, and early risers see the scarlet clouds break up and golden plumes of smoke from uniform dark homes turn white, and so on down to the smallest blade of grass and fallen leaf touched by the arriving light. Another day has come, another fabulous escape from the damages of night. So even the gulls in the ragged circle of their flight above the sea's long lanes that flash and fall scream their approval. How well the sun's rays probe the rotting carcass of a skate. How well they show the worms and swarming flies at work. How well they shine upon the fatal sprawl of everything on earth. How well they love us all. Poetry itself, like life, like love, like any spiritual hunger, thrives on longings that can never be fulfilled and dies when the poet thinks they have been. And what is true for the poem is true for the poet. No layoffs from this condensory, as Laureen Niedecker says. No respite from the calling that comes in the form of a question, no ultimate arrival at an answer that every arrangement of words is trying to be. Perhaps only bad poets become poets. The good ones, though they may wax vatic and oracular in public, and though they may even have full-fledged masterpieces behind them, know full well that they can never quite claim the name. Still, there are moments in any writer's life when the movement away from one kind of silence, the kind that keeps your soul suppressed, is decisive. I remember sitting in an empty classroom at Washington and Lee late into the night working on a poem instead of studying for an exam on international trade. I had spent 3 years as an economics major, endless afternoons in dead-aired classrooms from which I can't remember a thing in the world except that I wanted something so vague that it might as well be money. By the time of my last class in the C school, I was so hungry for meaning that everything was instantly allegorical. The blind professor who taught international trade, the desk he clung to like a life raft, the random dog that sauntered into that third-floor classroom one afternoon as if he owned the place. He stopped right in front of my desk, turned around twice before taking a disconcertingly deliberate shit, then trotted lightly out like an ironic angel. That's a true story. Not that the true path was by any means clear. I still had 20 years to ride on the high hook I knew only as ambition. It's almost the definition of a calling that there is strong inner resistance to it. The resistance is not practical. How will I make money? Can I live with the straitened circumstances, etc.? But existential. Can I navigate this strong current? And can I remain myself while losing myself within it? Reluctant writers, reluctant ministers, reluctant teachers. These are the ones whose lives and works can be examples. Nothing kills credibility like excessive enthusiasm. Nothing poisons truth so quickly as an assurance that one has found it. The impeded stream is the one that sings. That's Wendell Berry. The impeded stream is the one that sings. So now I'm going to skip 50 pages. That's the first bit of this book. And in the part I'm skipping, I talk about I studied with and knew Denise Levertov before she died, and we had a lot of disagreements that were sort of fundamental the way I thought about things. And I talk about an encounter I had with the poet Susan Howe, an unfortunate encounter that is all patched up now. And then Ammons again, and then how I came to edit Poetry Magazine and how bizarre and strange that was to have been a destitute poet for a long time and then come edit a magazine upon which $200 million landed, because Ruth Lilly gave the magazine $200 million just before I started. And so it was a different world. And I talk about some of that. And the question that I'm trying to ask is, besides what is it we want when we can't stop wanting, is what hunger is it that art is after? And what does this have to do with God? And these pages end. It's not simply that the hunger that gives rise to art must be greater than what art can satisfy. The hunger must be other than what art can satisfy. The poem is means, not end. When art becomes the latter, it eventually acquires an autonomous hunger of its own, and it does not wish you well. That's a quote from Frank Bedart. Hunger for what, though? Ah, the old questions, the old answers, says droll doomed ham in Endgame. How I love them. One obvious answer is God, the end, in both senses of that word, of all human longing. One devious answer is death, an urge in organic life to restore an earlier state of things, as Freud put it. One fashionable answer is that there is no answer. It's all just nature, genes rotely ramming home their mechanical codes one by one. We want because dissatisfaction equals survival. We are designed to improve and impart our hunger, breeding descendants with ever keener teeth. If we are conscious and honest, each of these answers will likely seem right at various times of our lives. If we are conscious and honest, each of them at another time will seem wrong. As I have worked on this essay, and really it is a kind of extended essay, it's 130 pages. They're doing it as a book, but it's an essay. As I have worked on this, which seems to feed equally on memory and oblivion, vitality and futility, I have thought repeatedly of this quote from the theoretical physicist and sometime theologian John Polkinghorne. What gives continuity are not the atoms themselves, but the almost infinitely complex information-bearing pattern in which they are organized. The essence of this pattern is the soul. It will dissolve at death with the decay of the body, but it is a perfectly coherent belief that the faithful God will not allow it to be lost, but will preserve it in the divine memory, that we might be remembered. What an almost impossible thought that is. That there is a consciousness capacious enough, merciful enough, to recall each of us in our entireties, just as we recall our own fragile but all meaningful moments, that our lives might be the Lord's insight. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, just before his execution by the Nazis in 1945, exhibited a bravery at once so bracing and daunting that one wants to find a chink in it. There isn't one, or there is only one. I want my life, he writes in a poem from that time. I demand my own life back, my past, you. This is not what one expects from a man confronting his own death. It's not the future that Bonhoeffer feels slipping from him, but the past. Not some totality of existence he fears losing. He still believes in salvation, but its molecular singularity. All the minute perceptions and sensations retained by the body, if not the mind, that comprise one particular human consciousness. This is an abstract articulation of a reality that is gloriously, excruciatingly concrete. What is it we want when we can't stop wanting? Lord, prays a character in Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic, give us what you have already given. I became editor of poetry in the summer of 2003, and the first official event over which I presided was a long-standing Chicago tradition called Poetry Day, which that year culminated with a large public reading by Mary Oliver. This was a challenge. Not only had Oliver been invited before I came on board, but also, just a few years earlier, I had written, for the very pages of poetry, a blistering review of her latest book, which, thank God, the editors had declined to publish. One of the great things about editing, though, is it teaches you to read toward enthusiasm. This is not necessarily the best stance for a critic, whose praise, if it's going to have any authority and credibility at all, should be rare and hard-won. And a too-instant enthusiasm can be lethal for a young poet who needs honest antipathies to sharpen the gift that her sympathies enlarge. An editor, though, especially one responsible for a monthly magazine, and especially one whose literary predispositions are, let us say, snarlish, quickly discovers that if complete critical approval is the only criterion for inclusion, then either he or the magazine is going under. I became a different kind of reader. I spent my first 3 months at Poetry reading through a year's worth of unread manuscripts that had accumulated because of the international publicity that the Ruth Lilly gift had caused and the demands that the publicity had placed on the tiny staff. There were only 3 people at the time. Bankers' boxes were piled floor to ceiling in the basement room of the Newberry Library, where the magazine then had its offices. It was in those early months that I began to develop Sisyphean powers of persistence that enabled me to trawl through manuscripts for 8 hours at a stretch. Learning to do this not only taught me something about my own limitations. It's tough to hold on to your one little aesthetic umbrella amid a storm of styles, but about survival, and not only of poems. I started out as a poet believing that greatness will out, as it were, that fate will find and save the masterpieces from oblivion no matter what. A decade of standing in that aforementioned storm has convinced me otherwise. Chance and power play a large part, and I feel sure that some genuinely great things fall through the cracks forever. But even aside from that, there are many, many poems that, though the future will likely find them cold and curiously dark, can nevertheless light the time we're in. This is a sadness, yes, but also a freedom. Take your eyes off eternity's horizon, and you might miss the meteor that flashes by every century or so, though I doubt it. But the immediate landscape is suddenly much more interesting. There is a spiritual lesson here. I can't say I had learned that lesson by the time I met Mary Oliver, but I was primed for it. What I had objected to in my review of her most recent book was a certain transactional element in her relationship with the natural world. The poet goes out for a walk and gets a daily dose of awe, as if nature were an epiphany machine. It ought to be harder than this, I had thought to myself. And then, as I worked my way backwards through all of her work, it suddenly was. A poem midway through American Primitive about an eerie owl striking some hapless and never-named creature. It was spare and unsparing, wholly alert and disquietingly narcotic at the same time. I read it over and over. I practically had it memorized by the time I left the office promptly at 5, a clerk of verse, and with the deathless prose of my first official introduction tucked carefully in my coat pocket, headed out to meet the most famous poet in the country. Famous poet. Hard even to utter the phrase without irony. It's like being famous in your family, Mark Strand once said. Strand meant to mock the whole notion of a poet being famous, at least with regard to real fame, at least in manic modern America with its 10 billion screaming screens. But between the ingenuous question and the ironized answer lies a complicated truth. American poets may pay lip service to old ideas of literary fame, that last infirmity of noble mind, as Milton said. And some may even aspire to it, but the word has become too corrupted to refer to that ambition. Fame is the common currency of American cultural life, and even among people and institutions who profess to have scorn for it. A poet can pretend not to be affected by this, which is what Strand, a Pulitzer Prize winner, tall as Gregory Peck and just as chiseled, was doing. But really, no one is immune. Those who feel cheated of fame become predictably embittered. Those granted some measure of fame can either reconcile themselves to the reality of being a poet in modern America taking some consolation perhaps in the fundamental incommensurability between the furious spirit that is the source of the poems and the frivolous energy that attaches to the poet. Or they can go all in with readings and social media mania and Q&As about what it's like, all the while accumulating something that is not really there. It is the dream of fame, the fumes of fame, which can come to enclose a public poet with an invisible but impenetrable nimbus. Not Mary Oliver. I first saw her in the lobby of her downtown hotel, dressed for this upscale occasion in hiking boots, wrinkled chinos, and what appeared to be a hunting jacket a size too large. It looked like she might have cut her own hair. Her head was bent over a thick book that I saw as she rose was the Fairy Queen. My face must have registered some surprise. "I'm not young," she shrugged as she opened her knapsack and exchanged Edmund Spencer for a pack of cigarettes. "I want to spend what time I have left with masterpieces." She meant it, too. I'd see her reading that massive poem 2 other times during the evening, once while sitting right beside me while waiting to go on stage. It didn't occur to me to be offended. By that point, I was in awe. And, I should say, in love. I knew my wife, who was not then my wife, but only a woman I had known for 3 gloriously disordered months, was sitting somewhere behind me in that auditorium. I could feel her presence just as surely as I had felt it that morning when, at the break of dawn, sublimely and purifyingly nude, she had spread her arms out wide in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows in my anonymous sublet and shouted, "It's Poetry Day, Chicago." If I hadn't fallen in love with her the instant we first met, I certainly had a few weeks later when I ran into her as if all my errands hadn't suddenly necessitated trips into her neighborhood, at a bookstore, where on a Saturday night she sat alone with a huge Riverside Shakespeare spread out in front of her, all her lovely attention given over to ruined Lear. I was a goner then, though for months we kept the relationship a secret because we worked together. I suspect, however, that the atmospheric pressure was apparent to anyone paying attention. And Mary Oliver pays attention. Realizing that from this distance makes me wince a bit. Mary was traveling alone because Molly, her partner for over 40 years, was already sick with the illness that would kill her. Not that Mary mentioned any of this to me. I don't know whether she was living in that initial period of obstinate, desperate disregard to which every cancer victim or caretaker seems to have recourse, or whether it was simply her nature. But she gave little hint of the catastrophe, and it must surely have felt, after 4 decades of what was obviously a great love, like catastrophe that loomed. We talked of Spencer and Emerson, of poetry, lowercase, and poetry, uppercase. I walked in distracted bliss, occasionally feeling the electric current when I brushed up against Danielle, occasionally fingering, Danielle had joined us, occasionally fingering the minuscule bump that had recently appeared just above my clavicle, so tiny and mercurial that half the time I couldn't find it. Somewhere along crowded Michigan Avenue, Mary suddenly stopped and picked up a piece of meat. At least that's what I thought at first. When she spread the gray-red mess out on her hands, you could see that it was, or at least had been, a bird. A pigeon, in fact, which she proceeded to describe with avid eyes and intelligent touch, showing us exactly where the hawk had struck, the talons clutched and torn. Most likely, she said, the hawk had dropped this half-eaten carcass into a crowd from which no recovery was possible. But all I could think of, or am I projecting this backwards, was a fate falling so hard that it split an existence right in two. We stood there for a moment, huddled around the half carcass in Mary's hands until I gently suggested we had to go. "Okay," Mary said. Then she stuck the bloody bird in the pocket of her jacket and walked on. I recall little of the reading and nothing of the introduction. Not so deathless after all, that prose. There have been so many of them by now. I myself have stood in front of countless audiences and heard poems that once came as mysteries pour forth as performance. It's not a lie, this performance. Crucial human communication and consolation can occur in these exchanges. But it's not a lie either. The self that intones the poem is not the soul that received it. One needs to know the difference. I suspect that Mary Oliver, up there in front of 800 people with half a dead pigeon in her pocket, did. Maybe that was the very reason she held on to that thing, to both recall and forestall the reality that was forcing itself upon her. And I do know that she held on to it, because at the party after the reading, which took place in one of the black classic Mies van der Rohe towers that make it seem as if you're floating out over Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, we both sought refuge in the kitchen at the same time. The first thing she did was to pull that apotropaic pigeon out to show me, to show us both, maybe, that it was still there. The sense of mortality, our own, of course, but also that of those we most love, doesn't cast us backward only. It also propels imagination forward. It makes us imagine heavens in which wounds are healed and losses restored, or to ameliorate oblivions by imagining our atoms alive in other forms. But heaven too often turns out to be little more than projections of the precious self ad infinitum. And it is a cold comfort to think of one's dear smithereens blasted throughout some new forms of matter from which we, whatever it is that makes us, have vanished. Here's Polkinghorne again. Death is present in this world because of the second law of thermodynamics, which says that in the end, disorder always wins over order. However, it seems perfectly coherent to believe that God could bring into being a new kind of matter with such strong self-organizing principles that the drift to disorder would no longer happen. Or perhaps that the notion of disorder would be naive, that we might be a form or part of a form whose fruition, for now, we can intuit but not inhabit, that heaven and oblivion might have one name, which every poet, in one way or another, is trying to speak. This is Mary. Coming down out of the freezing sky with its depths of light, like an angel or a Buddha with wings, it was beautiful and accurate, striking the snow and whatever was there with a force that left the imprint of the tips of its wings 5 feet apart, and the grabbing thrust of its feet, and the indentation of what had been running through the white valleys of the snow. And then it rose gracefully and flew back to the frozen marshes to lurk there like a little lighthouse in the blue shadows. So I thought, maybe death isn't darkness after all, but so much light wrapping itself around us, as soft as feathers, that we are instantly weary of looking and shut our eyes, not without amazement, and let ourselves be carried as through the translucence of mica, to the river that is without the least dapple or shadow, that is nothing but light, scalding aortal light, in which we are washed and washed out of our bones. Thank you.
Yes. So if you have written down questions that you would like to ask Chris on the index cards that were on the seats, please pass them to the center aisle, and our ushers will collect them. If this feels like offering time.
Yeah, it's for me. Is mine on?
Yeah, and if you have them later, you can just wave them in the air and someone will come and get them. Is that Matthew? Hey. So welcome again. And
thank you.
Please give it up one more time for Chris. So there are many kinds of writers and poets and community folks who could have this conversation, and I am a community-based and a public theologian and a public writer, and the stories that I take from here I have to take home, and so the questions I bring to you are the questions from my mama, basically.
Yeah.
And so tonight, as much as I have questions about your journey as a survivor and as a writer and surviving as a writer, I was also moved to provocations. Some of my questions aren't actually questions, but conversation prompts. So say we were at a cocktail party and you were interested in me.
Hilarious thought.
And you wanted to answer all of my half-thought questions with answers that would make me think that you thought I was the most fascinating person in the world. That's what a public theologian does. So I'd like to begin with your origin story. What is the name of the oldest relative in your family that you have a story about, either heard rumor of or actually know about? So maybe something about war, migration, the Dust Bowl, Union, Confederacy, tinkerers.
Yeah, my family came from South Carolina to Texas. They were sharecroppers and cotton farmers eventually, but first of all, sharecroppers. But when you asked me that, I immediately thought of my great-grandmother, and her name was Bira. And she was forced to get married when she was 14 years old, on her 14th birthday, to a much older man, and spent the first week hiding under the bed. And I never knew this until we recorded her when I got older, and she would never have talked about it when we were growing up. But yeah, when I think of my childhood, I think of my love for stories and language comes from the women in my family, but there's also some sort of deep silence there that I find very frightening, volatile, even still.
Yeah. I love the memory of your
great-grandmother. Yeah.
Great-grandmother being forced to marry. I wonder, because I believe that our stories are passed down through our DNA, that we come with a story, and I'm wondering what impulses or regrets or attitudes or ethics or beliefs that you believe, even in that story about your great-grandmother, are storied in your DNA.
You mean what stories they told, or what?
Or what did they pass down to you that you find yourself telling, a Bearda kind of story?
Yeah, I hate to say it, but it's a scream.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of that seems to me a kind of ferocity, withheld ferocity from my childhood. But I'd also think that the women were where faith was preserved. So it's that the survival of faith for me definitely comes to the women and from my family.
Yeah.
So those two things.
Yeah, Oh, thank you. This is my first time on the mic. Usually with a bullhorn. I like that faith is preserved through women because it has to be. I remember reading, I don't have any eggs, but that a woman is born with all the eggs that she'll ever, have. And so she's carrying her progeny and her grandkids and her children and her great-grandchildren. And if you think about faith in the feminine, then it makes sense that it's preserved that way because it's always there and it has to be there. For some reason, I wanted to know if you broke any bones when you were a kid.
I broke a lot of bones, yeah. I did. I broke my arm 4 times. Yeah, I broke a lot of bones. Yeah. These are unusual questions. But I did. I broke my arm. I got thrown off a horse. I got in a really bad fight once, broke my arm.
Yeah.
It was
nice. I like the fight breaking arm one.
Yeah.
From getting hit or from hitting?
Hitting.
Nice. You never hear about poets in fights breaking bones. Was there a story that your family told about healing, about fighting, about forgiveness, about manning up?
Well, there were a lot of stories like that, but my family was predisposed to see angels at moments of crises. I'm still waiting for mine. But yeah, when someone was near death, my grandfather saw an angel and quite convinced. He was not really a man to make that up. I mean, a stern fellow. But it happened to several members of it's happened to my mother. So I think they are inclined to a kind of visionary experience that I long for but have never had.
Wow. The last visitation from an angel was your mother?
Yeah.
Do you remember how old she was?
Oh, old as an adult.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So there's still time.
Yeah. I suppose it might happen right now. It's happening.
Still a lot of crises in the world. Still a lot of stuff to go through. Well, this is great because it brings us to My Bright Abyss, which I enjoyed reading as well. And I'm wondering if you can retell the conversion story and also the act of forgetting the conversion story because of the too realness of it that you mentioned, the way you had to explain it in a way in this modern world. So your conversion story.
Well, I had gone a long time without writing poems, and as is evident from what I just read, I had organized my entire adult life so that I would be able to write poems. Is this making a funny noise for you? Yeah. It's not oppressive. And so then I went through a period of 3 years of not being able to write. And if making art is the way that you're managing your experience, the way that you're translating reality into forms that you can deal with, not to have that outlet is pretty dangerous. And as I fell into a Great Depression, and then I met my wife. I mentioned that in that piece, and I also got a terrible diagnosis of cancer. All those things were raveled up together. But I don't think I had a conversion. It never felt like a conversion to me, and I've always been careful not to call it that. It was really as if I simply assented to a faith that had been latent within me all the time. And if I think of all those years when I've said I didn't have faith and certainly would never have found myself in a church, my favorite writers were writers of faith. Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping was the book that devastated me when I was 21 years old. It's in my head now because I just taught it a couple weeks ago. And you talk about the voice of women and silence, a kind of silence articulating something long buried. That was something that for me was absolutely fundamental. I actually think that book is a 20th century American Lear, but it's Cordelia's voice. It's Cordelia's voice. It is that voice suddenly saying something. But that's the story. Like I don't consider it a conversion.
Yeah. I like that. Is that the same with the poetry? Was poetry this thing that you actually found was already inside of you? And is there if it's not a conversion, it's a turning in to find the poet? Is that the same? Did poetry work the same way?
I don't know that faith would have survived in me without poetry. Poetry was the way in which I had some sort of access and gave some sort of credibility to the notion of the other, of there being some sort of transcendental meaning to life. And so those two things are raveled up to me in some confusing ways. You know, people always say that poetry is prayer. That irritates me. Sometimes it may be, but you know, often it's not. Kafka once he would write during the night, and after one of those nights, had a blissful night of inspiration, he gets up in the morning and writes a letter to his love, and he says, "I finally know what these moments of inspiration are. They're my reward for serving the devil." Now that puts a little different spin on it. Poetry is prayer. It's not always benign. You know, what you're being shown or what you're being given, and so I find the relationship more fraught than people usually allow.
I often think that I'm paying for some generational curse as a poet. You know, in 2018, you will have a poet in your family who will have to answer to, you know, so it becomes a
Because of what's the curse for, though? Because
my family did all kinds of shit. You know, my grandmother and on my mama's side, my mother's side, were visionaries who saw things and could fix things, and I believe that they were powerful and could do things like get lotto numbers and get other women's husbands. And I believe they were ran out of Louisiana. They didn't just migrate. And they became Jehovah's Witnesses and went into the witness protection program. So
you became a poet out of all that.
Yes. I had to get us out of debt. It's not working yet. There is also in My Bright Abyss, you say that to make death the final authority of our lives is to sow a seed of meaninglessness into that very insight. And given the insufficient answers of poetry and art and faith, how do these things defeat death?
Oh, well, I don't think faith is insufficient. I mean, I do think there's a great quote from the theologian that I love, Jürgen Moltmann: all theology has to be conducted in earshot of the dying Christ. All theology has to be conducted in earshot of the dying Christ. So you can't I don't think that faith just trumps death, that any person with faith is suddenly any less afraid of death than anybody else. But it does offer a way of, it does offer it's a way of being more realistic about it, I guess.
Yeah.
But I don't find that art, I'm getting tangled up in my thoughts here. Everything that I have done in art reaches an end that asks for something else. And I think what faith is a launching into that something else. And it offers no consolation. It offers no answer. I don't think that that a life in God can be an answer, an answer to human experience. It doesn't work like that. It humans don't get to apply the answer of God to human life. It just doesn't work like that. It's more that we are able, faith lets you live truths that you can't have, if that makes any sense. It lets you live into truths that you can't actually possess. I guess that's the way I understand it.
I like that. Because I feel like the charge that you gave is for us to write more. Because writing, after I read My Bright Abyss, it felt like writing helped me to dismantle like my childhood sandcastles, which I thought was like the height of my architectural career. That was everything. But there's no way that they could have survived, and I still hold it as the height of architecture. And it's the same with wounds, trauma, development, enlightenment. Writing, there's a risk of seeing the things for what they were when you go back to revisit them. But it also relieves ourselves of some of that baggage, because we shouldn't be holding these sandcastles into our 50s. So I'm wondering, how has writing been waiting for you when you've returned to it? How has it helped you heal? And how do we shrink to enter like these mouse-sized holes of stories with our grown bodies? How do we go back into these stories?
Yeah, I don't understand poetry any more than I feel more baffled by poetry now, the writing of it, than I did when I was 21 years old. When I was pretty baffled then, but I at least thought I had some idea of what I was doing. But I have to say now, I don't understand where poems come from. I don't know how I write them. I don't know how I finish them. Often, I don't even know what they mean. I'll finish something and not really know what it means until a couple years later, sometimes many years later. I won't really understand it. Sometimes it takes someone else to show me what's in there for me to understand it. So I feel at sea if you ask me how I'm expressing my life or what I'm finding in them, or it's just a bafflement to me. It's a mystery. But it's so necessary that when it's taken away from me, I go into I hardly feel it for a long time, and then a kind of seizure of panic sets in. And I realize that I'm not in my life without having those moments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. After reading Sorrow's Flower, I do a daily Facebook writing practice. It's called FWP. And I wrote that love always has to have the last word. I wonder if you could talk about love as inspiration, love as guidance, or love as poetry, as medicine, love that leads you somewhere, love as fount. Is this still weird?
No, okay. I understand that. I think that's a word that it's like the word God. Really, poets ought to really pause for a long time before they use it. Me too. But the word love is like that. I guess I have two things to say. One of the functions of poetry is to destroy cliches, to detonate them, to get rid of them, so that speech and thought and feeling can be reawakened in us. But another function of poetry is to make cliches mean again, to find some way in which they can come to mean again. So say this anthology I did, Joy. The very word has a whiff of sentimentality before you even think about it. Like joy, you just think, what? Come on. Is that just me? But, love is like that. Poets have been using love for years and years, but it's very difficult to use it convincingly. And when it's done, it can be such a revelation. There's a poem by Seamus Heaney called Sunlight Mossbawn, where it's an elegy to his aunt. And it ends, he's got all these wonderful details. She's dead, obviously, and it says, "And here is a space again, the scone rising to the tick of 2 clocks. And here is love like a tinsmith's scoop, sunk past its gleam in the meal bin. And here is love like a tinsmith's scoop, sunk past its gleam in the meal bin. That's fantastic, because it's the word itself is sunk past its gleam. So you feel the age in the word itself. He's reawakened it like that. It's amazing. But personally, I don't think I ever had any idea what the word meant until I met my wife. I was 36 years old. That's getting on. That's pretty late in the game to not have a clue. But I really think that I mean, she has changed the way that I think about poetry, certainly, changed the nature of the poems that I write, as have my kids.
Wow. I love that that your poems have a nature. I also loved in Sorrow's Flower, Christ is contingency. And please, it's quite possible that I misunderstood everything that I've read of your work.
That's flattering.
But I love the idea that Christ was a chance that God took, that all of creation is a chance. The striped tiger, the brown eye, the six toe, the mole, the sperm count, the egg, and how might uncertainty guide us in our humanness and in our writing. And if it leads you to read something, that would be...
Well, I want to read that poem that you keep mentioning, that Sorrow's Flower, which that's not what it's called, is it? But it's
that's a chapter.
That's a chapter, but it comes from a poem. What is the name of that poem? Oh, I've got it. Yeah, I get asked about that all the time. You'd think I'd have a good quick answer. What did I mean by that when I say Christ is contingency? I am absolutely convinced. This is not what I say all the time. Actually, this is not rehearsed. That there is some way in which we have to live with contingency and truth, both those possibilities at the same time, without either one canceling out the other. That when I think of of what God means, the existence of God, for us those two things cancel each other out. For God, I just don't think they do. There can be something that's absolute chance and absolute truth at the same time. That those two things exist at the same time. And that's my understanding of what faith is. Now this poem is called After a Storm. My sorrow's flower was so small a joy, it took a winter's seeing to see it as such. Numb, unsteady, stunned at all the evidence of winter's blind imperative to destroy, I looked up and saw the bare abundance of a tree whose every limb was lit and fraught with snow. What I was seeing then I did not quite know, but knew that one mite more would have been too much. You can have joy, and if you want to know the one difference between joy and happiness is you can have joy, I think, in the midst of great suffering, but I'm not sure you can have happiness in the midst of it. But often in the midst of terrible suffering, there can be a moment of joy that flowers inexplicably.
There's a lot of invitation in your writing to participate in the daily epiphany, the pedestrian epiphany, that we should be surprised by stuff all the time, and to not be surprised is not to live, and to be surprised. There's I'm going to go out of order, but there's a line, the things that are in the dirt are closer to death and understand it more. It felt like because they live in the dirt, and those of us who walk on it and build castles and homes and separate ourselves from every possibility of sinking down into the dirt, of getting dirty, have a harder problem with death.
Oh yeah, that's probably, yeah. That's probably, did I say that? I don't think I said that.
Yes.
I didn't say that. That's it. That comes as a revelation to me.
I told you I got it all wrong.
That's like as people get richer, they become less empathetic.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's true because we have our houses are separate. You go places in cars, and so you don't interact with people. You don't see all the different people, and so people just begin to seem completely other, completely separate. So it's easy to say, to hell with them.
Yeah, and now we, because of the logarithms of social media, we are getting fed the things that we know we already believe and like, and we're reinforcing our beliefs about what we find valuable and what we find important. I know social media makes the world smaller, but it also separates us, even more.
There's a wonderful quote. There's that what I was thinking about when you were talking about the necessity for wonder and the kind of wonder for the quotidian. There's a wonderful quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's a Jewish theologian that I use a lot in my classes and I love, who defines faith as not when we wonder at things, but we wonder with them. Mm-hmm. That there's some participatory element to attention, to attentiveness, which I think is a very beautiful way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I like that. I think a lot of process theology, which I love thinking about, is God inviting us and luring us and flirting with us, and our response is to be wooed and to flirt back if we're interested in, to participate in this coupling and in this attraction. I would like to talk some about Hammer is the prayer, and this is more where I want you to make me think I'm fascinating, because this book was amazing, and you could, I have just not even questions, but notes and curse words at the end of the poems, fuck, contractions. And so I'm going to try to ask questions based on these notes that I made. And with any of these poems, I would love for you to read if that feels like an appropriate response as well. Let's see, on One Good Eye, I just drew a heart, because a lot of my critical analysis involves drawing hearts. I love maybe The Long Way Home, The Long Home, rather, you can read, because I love the way you tell stories, because I really felt like I felt like I needed to go find the people and the places in those stories. And I'm like, I don't even know if they're real, but I want to go find them. And how do you do that to a reader? Or why would you do that to a reader?
Oh, they are real. When I was in my mid-20s, I had been living in various places, Prague and Mexico, and things had bottomed out. I'd ran out of money, and I went back to West Texas and lived in a trailer. And it was a trailer where I was born, as a matter of fact. But it was now in my grandmother's backyard, and my great-grandmother had lived in that trailer until she died. And so I moved in there, and my grandmother and my Aunt Sissy were living together in the house, which was a tiny little house. And I was trying to write and read all day. I was just this obsessed maniac trying to figure out what it meant to be a poet. And I was trying to write like people that I was reading. And then I couldn't figure out how to, my grandmother and aunt were just watching TV all the time. And they were really old, and they would watch, soap operas and game shows just all the time. And I couldn't figure out, how do we communicate? I can't watch these shows. And And so I just started asking them questions one day. And I just said, what were you doing when you were 15? Or then we just started, one thing led to another. And then that became our relationship. Every day I would go over there and I would just ask questions. And for a long time. And they turned the TV off and we just started talking. And so that became my whole first book eventually. Their stories, and in particular my grandmother's story. My whole first book is in her voice, almost the whole book. And so this is how the poem ends, called "The Long Home." It's just that much. Don't be scared. It's a long poem, but it's only that long. My grandson walks through walls he does not see. Touching nothing, he touches tools and stalls, a bucket and a clutch of warm eggs, the torn down hen house, well house, and the barn. He wonders where the fence line was, the maze, the garden, and the yard. Stands blinking back the brightness under the unshadowing eaves of the house, even the shade tree sheared away, high cotton blooming in these rooms of air. My grandson, leaning over the white rose, over the long porch gone to light, picks a lock of cotton and he wants to know if I would live it all again. Wind stirs in the leaves, in the windmill's vacant blades, spinning and spinning without sound. Wind threads unwhistling through the wind-split wood, over the filled-in well where something of the cold stone walls, of buried air and clear water rose when children we called down to hear a sound survive us. And it stirs before it dies these leaves that rise and fall like the leaves of the tall pecan tree in the shadow-flooded yard when the day was done, the work done, right here, where killdeer cried into our silences and locusts sang themselves out of their skins. He waits, listening. It is all still now. End of it.
I just realized that is like my angel visitation, that poem, as an adult. I'm very clear that I will never be called son again or grandson again by any person, because those relationships are gone now.
Yeah.
And when I read that poem, I felt like somebody was talking, who came back for me. And it was really beautiful that way. And before I turn this into therapy, I think we should take some questions from the audience. There's a couple more. If you missed the...
If we don't have time for all of them, come back tomorrow morning.
Yeah. And if we don't get to all the questions, come back tomorrow morning where there's a more intimate conversation that will be happening. But let's get some of you heard. Why be afraid of oblivion?
Why be afraid of it? I don't guess love is the answer to that, because I love the people around me. I love my grandmother in that poem. The thought that it all is just headed towards oblivion is painful to me. I don't fear it for myself. I fear it for those that I love, for the love that's in my life.
How has becoming a parent changed your art and your faith? And I love the person who wrote on the envelope, because that really got my attention.
It certainly gives me less time. I don't know that becoming a parent has changed my art. I don't know that. I don't know that it has. Like, again, I'm not the best one to comment on my own art. I just don't know. How it's changed my faith? Well, you want to teach your kids something. I have written a little bit about this. I feel like mostly they end up teaching me about faith, but I do find it's much more of a daily occurrence that I feel like I need to have faith so that they see it. Bonhoeffer said, Christ is always stronger in our brother's heart than in our own. It always seems like other people have more faith than we do. Faith always seems impossible for us. And that's exactly what Karl Barth said, is that a Christian knows that faith is impossible. Faith is completely impossible. And so I think being forced to feel it for someone else is a useful discipline. Ministers, of course, have to do this all the time.
Oh, me? Yes. Yes. Can you talk more about the two forms of silence? And there was also, I was trying to get to my notes, there's also a kind of crying too, that it was the kind that you can't see. But this one, and a lot of the work reminds me to think deeper about the different layers and depths and forms of these emotions. But this one, we wanted to know about the forms of silence.
Well, I think in that piece I said the kind that keeps your soul suppressed. I mean, there's one kind of silence that can annihilate you and one that can free you, I think. I mean, there's a kind of silence that we all need in which I think God is communicating with us. But then there's another kind that is simply destructive if it's forced upon us. And I think that's what was happening with a lot of the women in my family. But again, that's where I get both kinds.
In an age of Black Panther, this is my deep Wakandan voice, do white men have a voice that we should listen to now? And how do you identify or understand existence as a white male and as a Christian?
Is that your question?
That's Wakanda.
Oh, I haven't seen this movie. Am I the only one in here who hasn't seen it? Gosh, I don't know. If I have a voice that you need to hear, then hear it. But if it seems like it's too white, too male, then don't. I don't know what to say to that, really. I mean, I read all kinds of things and teach all kinds of things, but I am who I am. There's nothing I can do about it.
I think the Joy Anthology, represents, the most open invitation to bring, different voices into the center. I think, I looked through the book and, like I said, I recognize, several peers and colleagues and poets that I love, and our existence as women, as people of color, are often linked to our trauma and our tragedy. So joy is not its own thing. They want us to come through something, to have survived something, to experience joy. So the idea that our joy can be aligned with other just eruptions of joy, I think is a great practice, and which is one of the reasons why I love anthology.
I think I'll tell you a story. One of my students was a young African-American undergraduate at Yale. I do teach some undergraduates there, and they have to memorize poems and say something about them. And And for her poem, she was a computer science major, and for her poem that she memorized, she did George Herbert. George Herbert, right? Young African-American computer science major, and talked about what that poem, they have to introduce them, talk about how that fits into their life, and she talked about how that poem fit into her life as a young African-American student at Yale. It was amazing. It's like, it seems risky not to, to say that, I mean, there's a white male from, 15th century, 16th.
And hopefully the work goes both ways. We teach students how to bring the white male to her and not just how to trace herself back to them. That there has to be a reckoning that, his voice, if he's in America, is created off of her voice.
Interesting, what she was doing? They also have to bring in a poem where they talk about, they use what they're studying at the time and talk to illuminate the poem. She was designing a computer to be an eye, to do exactly what a human eye can do, but it's completely, as undergraduate. These people are unbelievable.
What is your writing practice like? I know raise your hand if you're a writer or a poet in the room, practicing, pretending, wannabe. Good deal. What is your writing practice like, and how does it compare with other spiritual disciplines that you keep?
Well, I used to write, I would keep just banker's hours. I would work all day long. Even if I couldn't write, I would be reading or messing with language in one way or another, doing something. But now it's really like, those of you who have kids know what it's like. It's just not like that. I do it when I have time. I have a full-time job. I work when I can. I don't sleep a lot, so I'm often up in the middle of the night, and I'll do things then. But it's not rigorous at all. And I don't worry about it so much. I expect long silences with poetry. With prose, I can usually do that no matter what, but with poetry, I expect long silences.
I tell, when I lead creative writing workshops, that writing isn't like a latchkey kid. It isn't mad at you for leaving it alone, and it doesn't cross its arms when you finally return to it. The only thing that writing can be is there for you, and you have to approach it like it's not, that it hasn't stopped growing.
Yeah.
That you just have to treat it like it has grown up since you left it, and meet it there. Please say more about the reality you mentioned. What once came as mystery now pours forth as performance. I feel this as a pastor and would love to hear more wisdom for keeping your soul in that space.
Yeah, I think I do imagine that's a problem as a pastor, because you have to preach when you don't feel like it. And you have to express faith when you don't feel it. You don't feel that you have any. I think that's a tough job, much more difficult than getting up and talking about your poems. I think being aware of that difference, one of the things that makes me suspicious about some poets is when I feel that they're not aware of the difference between, as I say, the self that intones the poem afterwards and the soul that receives it, that there's some distinction there. And if you're aware of it, then you can negotiate that. But when those two things become confused, I think it's deadly. But I'm teaching a course called Modern Faith right now. And so I've got to walk in and lecture to these students who are divinity school students on days when I don't feel like it. And so I do have some sense of what it's like. I admire that my minister friends, one in particular, says that it's not about him. It's about letting the Word of God go through you and not worrying about your own feelings. Try to let yourself as much as possible be the vessel for this. Be as honest as you can, but don't think. But as much as you can, get rid of your own ego. And that's what I try to do when teaching. As to how to keep it alive in you, solitude and silence. For me, I mean, you've got to protect yourself with solitude and silence. And so many ministers that I meet, including my students, don't do it. And our lives are designed not to do it. And their lives are especially just chaotic. And I think it has to be a discipline. And you have to resist this culture. I mean, because why not just give up social media? And if it's so poisonous, why not just give it up? I do think it's poisonous, actually. But at any rate, you have to find a way of giving something up so that you can have this space in your life.
Yeah. I like that. I think, this vesseling that we do is important, especially when we remember that we're unique. And so whatever God speaks through you is going to sound unique. Any two violins, any two saxophones, every instrument, even if it's the same instrument, will sound different depending on the maker, depending on the metals, where it was mined, or the wood. So each of us, if God speaks through you, it will be different and it will sound different, but we have to be open, to God speaking through us and knowing that it will be amplified. So lastly, what is immortality for? What is poetry for?
Oh my God. Immortality, I guess I've never thought of it. I don't have an answer. What is immortality for? I don't think of immortality as even being, I don't know. It's like, what is heaven for? I don't think that, for me, that faith that's not what faith is. Some notion of being immortal. Myself is going to be immortal. It's not what I think of it as. I feel no need to project my life in that way. So I guess immortality is for nothing. It's useless. There's no reason to think of immortality, I think. I guess that would be my answer.
And poetry, what is it?
Poetry is for right now.
Yes.
It's to seize your life right now, to be more in our lives.
I like that. Ladies and gentlemen, Christian Wiman. Give it up one more time.
Thanks, Marvin.
Thank you. So, tomorrow, there's a flyer in the lobby or on your pews. Tomorrow at 10:30, we'll be convening at All Souls Episcopal Parish. And it's going to be an amazing, intimate extension of this conversation. So please come out. We have books for sale in the lobby. Please buy a book and support the bookstore and support Chris as well. Thank you again for coming out.